The compound sits in darkness. A man's voice echoes through speakers mounted on wooden posts, crackling with static, warped by distance and desperation. Sullivan Knoth stands at a pulpit he carved himself from Arizona pine, one eye clouded and white, the other burning with certainty. Around him, women clutch infants to their chests. Men grip knives blessed in ceremonies that twisted scripture into permission. Children watch with faces that stopped asking questions years ago. This is Temple Gate. This is the place God chose. This is where paradise ends. But it started somewhere else. It always does. It started with debt collectors and disconnection notices, with a shoe salesman in Albuquerque listening to evangelical radio late one night, searching for comfort he would never find. What he found instead was something older than comfort, something hungrier than faith. He found a voice that told him he was chosen. He found a voice that told him everyone else was already dead. This is the story of how Sullivan Knoth built a doomsday cult following the exact blueprint written by men who came before him. This is the pattern Jim Jones, David Koresh, and Marshall Applewhite all discovered independently. The formula that transforms ordinary failure into divine mission, that turns bankruptcy into prophecy, that makes mass death feel like salvation. Temple Gate burns. Bodies lie in rows. Children stop breathing. What you might not know is that every step toward that ending was predictable, documented, repeated across decades by different men in different places who all arrived at the same terrible conclusion. This video will show you that pattern. It will walk you through the specific mechanisms these leaders used to control communities, to justify atrocity, to convince followers that their deaths served a higher purpose. By the end, you will understand something uncomfortable about human psychology, about the specific vulnerabilities that make us susceptible to prophets who preach annihilation. This is educational analysis of dangerous ideologies and the manipulation tactics used to maintain them. If you find something in this video that resonates with you, please drop a comment letting me know what part connected, whether it was a specific pattern you recognized, a psychological mechanism that made sense, or just a moment that made you think differently about what draws people toward destruction. You can also suggest topics for future analysis. So now settle in, turn the lights down, and let's begin. Chapter 1. The Shoe Salesman Who Heard God. Sullivan Knoth was born in either 1933 or 1937. The records disagree. The kind of ambiguity that lets a man remake himself without contradiction. What is documented is that by 1966, he worked selling shoes in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He was unremarkable. He was failing. The bank was preparing to take his home. Everything he touched turned to debt. The desperation of a man about to lose everything should not be underestimated. Financial ruin creates a specific psychological vulnerability. It strips away the identity built on stability, on the belief that your effort produces security, on the assumption that playing by the rules protects you. When those assumptions collapse, when the system you trusted reveals it never cared whether you lived or died, a void opens. That void will fill with something. The question is what finds it first. For Sullivan Knoth, what found him was an evangelical radio station. He turned it on late one night in 1966, looking for consolation, for reassurance, for words that might make his approaching catastrophe feel survivable. The sermon sickened him. Whatever preacher spoke that night failed to reach him. The message felt hollow, commercial, wrong, but underneath the sermon, beneath the practiced cadence and rehearsed comfort, Knoth heard something else. He heard static. He heard a voice emerging from the interference, speaking directly to him through the noise. The voice told him God was displeased with the churches of the world. The voice told him a new prophet was needed. The voice told him he was that prophet. This moment is sourced from the Gospel of Knoth itself. It is the founding revelation of his entire movement. It is also a textbook example of auditory hallucination paired with confirmation bias amplified by acute stress. When the brain is desperate for meaning, when external circumstances create unbearable pressure, it generates patterns from randomness. The static becomes speech. The coincidence becomes divine intervention. The voice is real to the person hearing it, neurologically indistinguishable from actual external sound. But the content of the voice, what it says, always reflects what the listener needs to believe. Knoth needed to believe his failure was not failure. He needed to believe the system that was crushing him was corrupt, illegitimate, already condemned by higher authority. He needed to believe he was chosen rather than broken. The voice gave him that belief. The voice reframed his bankruptcy as transcendence. "You are losing everything earthly," the voice said, "because earthly things do not matter. You are being prepared for something greater." He walked outside. In his vision, he saw the prophet Ezekiel, an angel with many faces crowned in fire, surrounded by wheels nested in wheels. This is biblical imagery pulled directly from the book of Ezekiel chapter 1. The original prophet described this vision during the Babylonian exile, during a period of national catastrophe and displacement. Ezekiel saw divine machinery descending from heaven, representing God's mobile throne, proving that God had not abandoned his people even in foreign lands. Knoth appropriated this imagery wholesale. He placed himself inside the role of biblical prophet, witnessing divine machinery. The vision validated everything. He was not a failed shoe salesman. He was the new Ezekiel. With this revelation burning in his mind, Knoth abandoned his possessions and his debts. He became a street preacher, driven by his revelation. His passion inspired people who felt lost in the world. Within a year, he had dozens of followers. These were not stupid people. These were not uniquely damaged people. These were people experiencing the same financial and spiritual desperation Knoth had experienced. People looking for the same thing he had found, a narrative that made their suffering meaningful. The followers donated their possessions to the nascent church dubbed Testament of the New Ezekiel. They purchased a ranch owned by a wealthy woman named Lydia Deegan. They lived communally. Sullivan Knoth continued receiving messages from God, messages he faithfully recorded in a book of verse he called the Gospel of Knoth. The content of these Gospels mixed sexual imagery with religious apocalypticism, instructions about breeding and childbirth wrapped in language about paradise and damnation. Knoth often encouraged all the women of the flock to breed frequently. He personally delivered each baby. He donated his own seed to the cause, impregnating multiple women in service to God's command to build the flock. This pattern of sexual control appears in nearly every destructive cult. The leader reserves sexual access to followers while prohibiting sexual relationships between followers themselves. This serves multiple functions simultaneously. It creates biological children, loyal to the leader from birth, raised inside the ideology without exposure to alternatives. It reinforces the leader's unique status, his divine exemption from rules that bind ordinary members. It generates shame and dependency in the women involved, who must rationalize their participation as spiritual duty rather than exploitation. And it isolates members from forming pair bonds that might compete with loyalty to the group. The home births gave New Mexico police legal authority to crack down on the cult. With a warrant for health and safety violations, police raided Deegan's ranch and arrested a dozen cult members. Knoth barely escaped with a handful of followers. All of their assets were seized. The church was in serious danger of falling apart. This is the first crisis point. Many nascent movements collapse here when external pressure reveals the prophet's vulnerability, when the real-world consequences of defying authority become undeniable. Followers scatter. The leader either disappears or faces prosecution. The movement dies, but some leaders double down. Some leaders use the persecution as validation, as proof that the corrupt system fears them specifically because they speak truth. Jim Jones did this. David Koresh did this. Marshall Applewhite did this. Sullivan Knoth did this. Following what he described as the guidance of Moses and Abraham, Knoth climbed a mountain alone to commune with God. He waited on the mountaintop, naked in the wilderness, until God's voice commanded that he sacrifice an eye in exchange for true vision. Chapter 2. The Mountain, the Knife, the Eye. Imagine the mountain. Somewhere in the New Mexico wilderness, Far enough from civilization that screaming carries no consequences, Sullivan Knoth stands naked on rock heated by the sun, skin burning, dehydrated, hallucinating. How long has he been here? Days, probably. Long enough for rational thought to fragment, long enough for the voice to become the only voice he trusts. The command is clear. Sacrifice an eye, gain vision. The logic is biblical. Abraham prepared to sacrifice Isaac. Moses encountered the burning bush. Prophets throughout Scripture undergo physical trials that prove devotion and unlock revelation. This is not metaphor. This is not symbolic. God wants flesh. God wants proof. Knoth unsheathed his knife. He positioned the blade against his left eyeball. The pain would have been extraordinary, the kind of pain that triggers shock, that makes the body shut down voluntary movement in self-protection. But Knoth did not stop. He describes in his own gospel that his face was washed with tears and blood. The act was completed. The sacrifice was made. And in response, the veil of reality fell away. This is documented in the Gospel of Knoth, chapter 2. God speaks to him directly in the text, explaining that Knoth did not cut away his eye, but rather cut away the scale he had mistaken for an eye. Now you may see, God tells him. The mutilation is reframed as healing, as removing the obstacle to perception. This is the core delusion solidifying. Knoth can no longer trust external reality because external reality contradicts what the voice tells him. So the voice explains that what looks like injury is actually restoration. What feels like madness is actually clarity. With this act, the veil of reality fell away, and Knoth saw with absolute certainty the destiny of his church. He foresaw a town deep in the wilderness, hidden from civilization, that would be the gateway to the true temple of the testament of the new Ezekiel. He would call this town Temple Gate and take his followers there to prepare for the end of times. The self-mutilation serves a specific psychological function beyond validating the delusion. It creates a sunk cost so profound that retreat becomes impossible. Knoth cannot admit he cut out his eye for nothing. He cannot admit he experienced trauma-induced hallucination on a mountain and destroyed his own body for a voice that was never there. The physical damage locks him into the narrative. Every time he looks in a mirror, every time someone sees his ruined eye, the sacrifice is reinforced. He must make it mean something. He must make it divine. He returned to his followers and warned them that the road would be long and the horrors many. They would all be forced to make difficult sacrifices and impossible choices in the hope of salvation and paradise everlasting. This warning is crucial. It primes followers for escalating demands. It establishes that suffering is not a flaw in the plan, but evidence the plan is working. When things get worse, when the sacrifices become unbearable, followers will remember this warning and interpret their pain as progress toward salvation. It was the winter of 1969 when Sullivan Knoth and nearly 100 followers caravanned out into the desert and left their wicked world behind. They traveled for years. In 1971, Knoth and his followers arrived at the place that would later become Temple Gate. The town was established in a remote area of the Navajo Nation. The land was not empty. The land was not abandoned. The land was not waiting for Sullivan Knoth to claim it in God's name. The land was home to the Pueblos, Mescalero, and Navajo peoples. The cultists forcefully displaced these indigenous communities. They took land that was not theirs and called it paradise. The violence of this displacement is rarely discussed in analyses of Temple Gate, but it is essential to understanding what the testament represents. This is not a group seeking isolation to practice faith peacefully. This is a group enacting colonial violence in miniature, claiming that their spiritual mission justifies the removal of people who were already there. The fact that Knoth writes about this in his gospel without shame, describing the displaced peoples by name as if their presence was an obstacle God placed for him to overcome, reveals the totality of his moral collapse. They are not people, they are scenery. They are the fallen Christ's stolen Zion that Sullivan must reclaim. This is the pattern beginning to emerge. A failed man hears a voice. The voice tells him he is special. He gathers followers who need to believe they are special. External authority challenges him. He escalates, sacrificing more, demanding more, proving devotion through irreversible acts. He displaces others without guilt. He builds a compound where normal rules do not apply, and then he waits for God to tell him what comes next. What comes next is always worse than what came before. In the New Gospels, Knoth is shown to be hesitant about certain things. The voice that gives him the Gospels tells him that the Antichrist will be born from his own flock. This revelation creates an impossible problem. Knoth has spent years building his community through breeding, through impregnating women and commanding others to reproduce in service to God's plan. Now the same voice tells him that one of these children will be the Antichrist, that the very act of reproduction he has been commanding is the mechanism through which damnation will enter his paradise. After a while, Knoth is encouraged to kill the children to preserve Templegate's paradise. The source material heavily implies that this encouragement comes from an external force, that Murkoff Corporation's radio towers are broadcasting signals into the area that create mass hallucination and intensify existing delusions. But to Knoth, the distinction between hallucination and divine revelation does not exist. The voice is God, the command is absolute. This is where the theology becomes the justification for mass infanticide. Knoth develops a systematic doctrine. The prevention of the Antichrist requires the elimination of all potential vessels. Since the voice has not specified which child will be the Antichrist, all children are suspect. Better to kill the innocent than risk allowing evil to mature. The logic is airtight within his framework. The horror is total from any framework outside it. Temple Gate becomes a place where pregnancy is both commanded and punished. Women are forced to breed. Knoth personally impregnates many of them, including a 15-year-old girl named Anna Lee. The cult operates under a doctrine that makes childbirth inevitable and children's deaths required. This psychological trap, this double bind, creates a community living in permanent cognitive dissonance. Everything they do is both obedience and transgression. There is no way to serve God correctly, because God's commands contradict each other. The followers internalize this contradiction as their own failure. They must breed, but must not allow the Antichrist. When children are killed, it is presented as mercy, as preventing worse suffering, as protecting paradise from corruption. The murdered infants become martyrs in Knoth's theology, innocent sacrifices whose deaths hold back the apocalypse. The parents who allow their children to be killed are praised as faithful. The parents who resist are hunted as heretics. This is the environment that exists when Blake and Lynn Langerman arrive at Temple Gate. This is the compound in full operation, decades into its isolation, completely consumed by its own logic. The town has killed all children, even the unborn ones, believing this obedience will preserve their path to salvation. Knoth has isolated the syphilitics into the mountains. He has turned a woman named Marta into his personal executioner, commanding her to kill every sinner she encounters. He has created a splinter group called the Heretics, who believe the Antichrist should be born rather than prevented, who worship the coming apocalypse rather than trying to stop it. Temple Gate is the pattern in its terminal phase, the moment before total collapse, the compound holding its breath before the final broadcast. And that broadcast is coming. Knoth can feel it. The voice is changing. The certainty that has guided him for decades is fracturing. Something is wrong with his paradise. Something he cannot control. Something that will force him to make one final choice about what obedience means. But before we see how Temple Gate ends, we need to understand how this exact pattern has played out before. How other men heard different voices commanding different deaths, but arrived at the same conclusion. Because Sullivan Knoth did not invent this, he is not the first shoe salesman to become a prophet. He is not the first leader to mutilate himself for divine vision. He is not the first prophet to command his followers to die. The pattern existed before him. The pattern is what we need to understand. The pattern starts with a man who has failed at everything else. That explains why the cult exists. That explains how a bankrupt shoe salesman convinced hundreds to follow him into the wilderness. How he justified displacing indigenous peoples and calling it God's will. How he built a theology that required murdering children to prevent an apocalypse. But it does not explain why this exact sequence has repeated across different times, different places, Different men who never met Sullivan Knoth but followed his script word for word. Jim Jones started as a street preacher in Indiana. David Koresh started as a troubled musician in Texas. Marshall Applewhite started as a music teacher suffering a breakdown in Houston. None of them knew about Temple Gate, but all of them ended the same way Sullivan Knoth ended. All of them commanded their followers to die. All of them believed death was the gateway to something better. All of them were wrong. The pattern is not coincidence. The pattern is replication. There is a specific psychology to apocalyptic cult leadership. Specific stages these movements pass through. Specific mechanisms that transform ordinary religious communities into death cults. The men are different. The details are different. The underlying structure is identical. And once you see the structure, once you understand the pattern, you will never see these movements the same way again. What you will see instead is something worse than random madness. You will see a roadmap. You will see the warning signs. You will see exactly where each community is on the timeline toward mass death. And you will understand why stopping them is almost impossible once certain thresholds are crossed. Because the pattern does not require the leader to be insane. The pattern works perfectly well with leaders who are calculating, strategic, and fully aware of what they are doing. The pattern works because it exploits fundamental human needs that exist in all of us. Vulnerabilities that cannot be removed without removing our capacity for meaning itself. Let's trace that pattern through the men who came before Knoth, the prophets who wrote the instruction manual he would follow without ever reading. Chapter 3. The Pattern Jim Jones Knew. James Warren Jones was born May 13, 1931, in rural Indiana during the Great Depression. His father was a disabled World War I veteran, poisoned by mustard gas, living on disability payments. His mother worked constantly to keep the family from starvation. Jones was largely left to himself, a lonely child with too much time to think and no one to teach him how thinking should work. He discovered religion the way Sullivan Knoth would discover it decades later, through desperation, through need, through the discovery that words about God carried power, that words about anything else did not. By his teenage years, Jones was practicing sermons in empty rooms, refining his cadence, learning how to make his voice sound like it carried truth rather than opinion. He was not interested in theology, he was interested in control. In 1955, Jones founded the People's Temple in Indianapolis. He positioned himself as a progressive voice, advocating for racial integration at a time when most churches remained segregated. This gave him moral authority that transcended religious doctrine. He was not just preaching salvation, he was preaching justice. The people who flocked to him were Black Americans experiencing systematic oppression, poor whites abandoned by economic systems that promised prosperity, elderly people facing isolation and poverty. These were not fools. These were people correctly identifying that the world was broken and seeking someone who claimed to know how to fix it. Jones performed faith healings. He claimed to cure cancer, to make the paralyzed walk, to drive out demons. These performances were fraudulent. Former members would later testify that Jones planted people in the audience with fake ailments, that he used information gathered beforehand to create the illusion of supernatural knowledge, that the healings were theater designed to prove divine authority. But the fraud does not diminish the impact. The people who witnessed these performances believed they were real. The belief created real psychological effects. The hope that someone could heal them, that suffering was not inevitable, that a higher power was intervening on their behalf, that hope was real even when the healing was not. This matters because it establishes a crucial pattern. The cult leader needs to convince followers he is supernatural. Once that belief is established, once followers accept that the leader has a direct connection to divine power, every subsequent command carries that authority. If he can heal cancer, why would he lie about anything else? If God speaks through him, who are you to question? By the early 1970s, Jones had moved the People's Temple to Northern California, establishing a headquarters in San Francisco. He cultivated political connections. Mayor George Moscone appointed him chairman of the San Francisco Housing Commission in 1976. Politicians praised him publicly. He positioned himself not just as a religious leader but as a civic figure, someone doing important work in underserved communities. This mainstream acceptance provided cover. It made criticism of the People's Temple seem like criticism of racial justice, of housing reform, of progressive politics. Anyone who questioned Jones could be framed as opposing the good work he was doing. But inside the temple, the dynamics were changing. Jones began calling himself God's socialist. He stomped on the Bible during services, claiming that Christianity had become corrupted, that true faith required moving beyond Scripture into direct divine revelation. He took sexual partners as he wished, including married women, including men, including teenagers. He forbade his followers from having sexual relationships with anyone except him. This is the same pattern Knoth enacted at Temple Gate. The leader's sexuality is divine freedom. Everyone else's sexuality is sin requiring control. Jones also implemented disciplinary systems that escalated in severity over time. Members found guilty of infractions were forced to engage in boxing matches with stronger individuals, fights designed to be one-sided, to humiliate rather than test. Children were beaten in front of the congregation for minor transgressions. Adults who questioned Jones faced public humiliation, forced confessions, psychological torture disguised as correction. Sleep deprivation became standard. Members worked long hours, attended services that lasted several hours each evening, and were given minimal food. Exhaustion makes the mind more susceptible to suggestion. Exhaustion makes resistance feel impossible. One former member, Terry Buford O'Shea, later described Jones's explicit strategy. He told her directly, "Let's keep them poor and tired, because if they're poor they can't escape, and if they're tired they can't make plans." This is not delusion. This is not a prophet genuinely believing he serves God. This is calculated control. This is a man who understands exactly how to trap people in a system that will eventually kill them. By 1977, media exposés began revealing the reality inside the People's Temple. Reports of financial misconduct, faked healings, physical abuse, psychological manipulation. Jones faced investigation. He faced the possibility of arrest. He faced the collapse of the authority he had spent decades building. This is the second crisis point, the moment that determines whether the movement implodes or escalates. Jones chose escalation. He moved the community to Guyana, to a remote compound in the jungle that he named Jonestown. He presented this as the fulfillment of his vision, the creation of a socialist paradise free from American corruption. Nearly 1,000 people followed him into that jungle. They surrendered their passports. They surrendered their money. They surrendered any practical means of escape. Jonestown was not paradise. Jonestown was a prison. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, ostensibly to protect against external enemies, but functionally to prevent escape. Members were assigned to spy on each other, to report dissent, to ensure no private conversations occurred without Jones's knowledge. Food rations were inadequate. Tropical diseases spread unchecked. Members slept in crowded dormitories, worked from dawn until dark, and gathered each evening to listen to Jones preach for hours. The content of these sermons grew increasingly apocalyptic. Jones warned that the compound might be attacked, that enemies were gathering, that they should be ready to die rather than surrender. He began conducting what he called white nights, rehearsals for mass death. Members would be woken in the middle of the night, ordered to assemble, and given cups of liquid they were told contained poison. They were commanded to drink. Most obeyed. After they drank and did not die, Jones would congratulate them for passing a loyalty test. This is psychological conditioning. This is training people to obey the command to drink poison, so that when the real poison comes, the action feels familiar, almost routine. They have practiced this moment dozens of times. The only difference is that this time they will not wake up. On November 17, 1978, United States Congressman Leo Ryan arrived in Guyana with reporters and family members of cult members. He came to investigate allegations of abuse, of people being held against their will, of systematic human rights violations. Jones allowed the visit. He had no choice. Refusing would confirm everything Ryan suspected, but he could not allow Ryan to leave with defectors. He could not allow the truth to reach the outside world unchallenged. On November 18th, as Ryan's party prepared to leave from an airstrip near Jonestown, Jones ordered their assassination. Gunmen opened fire. Ryan and 4 others were killed, including one reporter. Several people were wounded. Some escaped into the jungle. Jones knew that survivors would bring authorities. He knew the compound would be raided within hours or days. He knew his control was ending. He activated his final plan. Jones commanded his followers to drink cyanide-laced punch. He framed it as revolutionary protest, as refusing to allow the enemy to capture them, as choosing dignity over surrender. He did not call it death, he called it translation, ascension, stepping through to the other side where they would all be together in peace. More than 900 people died that day. More than 200 of them were children. Some drank willingly, believing Jones's promises. Some were forced, held down while poison was poured into their mouths or injected into their bodies. Some tried to run and were shot by armed guards, ensuring compliance. Jim Jones died of a gunshot wound to the head, possibly self-inflicted. He did not drink the poison. He did not translate to the other side. He ended his own life with a bullet and left his followers to die by chemicals that caused excruciating suffering before respiratory failure stopped their hearts. This is the pattern in its complete form. Financial or social failure precedes the founding vision. The leader claims direct communication with divine authority. The community forms around promises of healing, justice, or salvation. External persecution validates the leader's warnings and increases group cohesion. The leader isolates the community geographically and psychologically. Sexual control and disciplinary escalation create an environment of fear and dependency. A second external crisis threatens the leader's authority. Rather than surrender that authority, the leader commands collective death and frames it as transcendence. The community dies. The leader either dies with them or escapes and claims they achieved what he promised. Sullivan Knoth followed this pattern without knowing Jim Jones existed. He isolated his followers at Temple Gate. He commanded their sexuality. He created a theology requiring child murder. He faced an external crisis when Blake and Lynn Langerman arrived. And when his control began slipping, when the voice started contradicting itself, when Lynn's pregnancy proved his theology could not prevent what he claimed to prevent, Knoth made the same choice Jones made. He broadcast one final message to his followers. He ordered them to poison themselves. He told them this was the gateway to paradise. Temple Gate ended the way Jonestown ended because the pattern permits only one ending. Once the leader has built a community around apocalyptic certainty, once he has commanded escalating sacrifices to prove devotion, once he has made survival in the outside world psychologically impossible for his followers, the only resolution is death. Either the community dies together or it fractures and the leader faces accountability for what he has done. And leaders like Jones, like Knoth, cannot face accountability. Their entire identity is built on being right, on being chosen, on being the sole interpreter of divine will. Admitting they were wrong would unmake them completely. Death is preferable, and if they must die, if the pattern must end, they will take everyone with them. But Jones is not the only template Knoth echoes. There is another pattern, one that involves government intervention instead of jungle isolation, one that involves armed standoff instead of poison punch, one that ends in fire instead of bodies in neat rows. Chapter 4. The Prophet Who Needed Followers to Die. Vernon Wayne Howell was born August 17, 1959, in Houston, Texas, to a 14-year-old mother. He never knew his father. He was raised by his grandparents. He described his childhood as lonely and indicated he suffered abuse at the hands of his stepfather. He was not stupid. By 18, he claimed to have memorized both the New and Old Testaments. He was not stable. He experienced what he described as direct communication with God, visions that told him he was chosen for a specific purpose. In 1981, at age 21, Howell joined the Branch Davidians, a religious sect in Waco, Texas that had splintered from Seventh-day Adventism. The group was led by Lois Roden, widow of the founder, a woman in her late 60s. Howell began a relationship with Lois that was likely sexual, though this is disputed. He claimed God wanted him to father a child with her who would become the chosen one. Whether this was genuine delusion or calculated manipulation is unclear. What is clear is that it gave him access to the group's inner circle and positioned him as a potential successor. In 1983, Howell began teaching his own biblical interpretations in sessions he called New Light. He claimed the gift of prophecy. He claimed to understand Scripture in ways the existing leadership did not. This created conflict with George Roden, Lois's son, who expected to inherit leadership of the Branch Davidians. The dispute escalated. In 1984, George Roden and his supporters drove Howell out of the Mount Carmel compound at gunpoint. This is Crisis Point 1. The prophet is rejected. The community he tried to infiltrate expels him with violence. Many would retreat here, would accept that this particular path is closed. Howell did not retreat. He gathered followers loyal to him specifically and moved to eastern Texas, where they lived under difficult conditions. He traveled to Israel, where he claimed to have a vision revealing he was the modern-day incarnation of the prophet Cyrus, who liberated the Jews from Babylon. He legally changed his name to David Koresh, David for King David, establishing his claim to the biblical house of David. Koresh from Cyrus, cementing the connection to the prophet who freed captives and allowed them to rebuild their temple. In 1987, Koresh and his armed followers returned to Waco. A gunfight broke out with George Roden's group. Koresh was shot but survived. Koresh was tried for attempted murder but received a mistrial. His followers were acquitted. Roden was later arrested for murdering someone else and was committed to a mental institution. The Mount Carmel compound stood empty. Koresh moved in and claimed it in God's name. This is the pattern again. Failure becomes persecution, becomes validation, becomes violent reclamation. Koresh did not peacefully inherit leadership. He took it through force after being expelled, reframing the violence as righteous battle against corruption. Once he controlled the compound, he implemented the same systems Jones implemented, the same systems Knoth implemented. Koresh declared himself the final prophet, the Lamb mentioned in Revelation chapter 5. Traditional Christianity interprets this Lamb as Jesus Christ. Koresh reinterpreted it as himself, claiming he would come before Jesus' second coming to prepare the way. This reinterpretation is crucial because it makes Koresh more important than Jesus in the immediate timeline. Jesus will come eventually. Koresh is here now. Koresh's words carry more weight because he is present, active, speaking directly to his followers while Jesus remains future and abstract. He took multiple wives, including girls as young as 11 years old. He called them spiritual wives. He taught that God had commanded him to create a new lineage of world leaders through these unions, that the children he fathered would be specially chosen, that denying him sexual access was denying God's plan. Meanwhile, he forbade other men in the community from having sexual relationships. Married couples were separated. The men were told to remain celibate. The women were told their bodies belonged to Koresh alone. This created the same power dynamic that exists in every cult following this pattern. The leader's sexuality is divine. Everyone else's sexuality is profane and requires suppression. Koresh also stockpiled weapons. The Branch Davidians acquired 136 firearms, including assault rifles and handguns. They acquired components for converting legal weapons into illegal machine guns. They acquired materials for making grenades and explosive devices. Koresh told his followers they were building an army of God, that they needed to be prepared for the apocalyptic confrontation he prophesied. Other members claimed the weapons were sold at gun shows to generate revenue for the sect. Both explanations could be true simultaneously. The weapons served dual purposes: practical income and theological preparation. The accumulation of illegal weapons caught the attention of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. In May 1992, the ATF began investigating Koresh and the Branch Davidians. By February 1993, they had gathered sufficient evidence to obtain arrest warrants for Koresh and search warrants for the compound. On February 28, 1993, the ATF attempted to execute those warrants. They arrived at Mount Carmel with a plan for a sudden daylight raid, but a local reporter who had been tipped off about the raid asked for directions from a postal worker who happened to be Koresh's brother-in-law. The Davidians were alerted. The element of surprise was lost. When ATF agents approached the compound, heavily armed cult members were waiting in ambush. Gunfire erupted. The battle lasted 4 hours. 4 ATF agents were killed. 6 Branch Davidians were killed. Koresh himself was shot and injured. Both sides accused the other of firing first. The truth of who initiated violence may never be definitively established. What is established is that Koresh had prepared his followers for exactly this confrontation, that he had prophesied it, that when government agents arrived with weapons, it confirmed everything he had been teaching about persecution and spiritual warfare. The FBI took command of the situation. What followed was a 51-day siege. FBI negotiators communicated with Koresh by telephone. Koresh engaged in lengthy biblical discussions, dense theological arguments about prophecy and end times. He promised to surrender after completing religious documents he claimed were necessary for his mission. He delayed, he stalled, he used the standoff as proof of his prophetic accuracy. He had told his followers the apocalypse was coming. Here it was, exactly as predicted, government forces surrounding them, the final battle beginning. Inside the compound, conditions deteriorated. Koresh was seriously wounded and not receiving proper medical treatment. Children were present, including many fathered by Koresh himself. The FBI used psychological tactics, playing loud music and shining bright lights at night to deprive the Davidians of sleep. The negotiators attempted to embarrass Koresh by informing other members about his personal failures and contradictions. These tactics did not produce surrender. These tactics reinforced the siege mentality, the belief that external forces were evil, that only Koresh could be trusted. On April 19, 1993, the 51st day of the siege, the FBI decided to force the situation. They introduced CS gas, a form of tear gas, into the compound using armored vehicles. The goal was to make conditions inside unbearable, to force the Davidians to evacuate. Instead, fires broke out, multiple fires starting simultaneously in different locations within the building complex. The subsequent investigations concluded that the Branch Davidians set the fires themselves. Audio surveillance captured discussions between Koresh and others about pouring fuel on hay as the fires started. The FBI maintained that none of their agents fired live rounds on the day of the fire. Critics contended that live rounds were indeed fired, and that the combination of gunfire and flammable CS gas caused the blaze. The definitive truth remains contested. What is not contested is that 76 people died in the fire, including David Koresh and 23 children. Some died from smoke inhalation, some died from burns, some died from gunshot wounds, apparently inflicted by fellow cult members to prevent burning to death. The compound was destroyed completely. The bodies were found in clusters, some in positions suggesting they had been trying to reach exits that were blocked or trapped by fire. David Koresh did not command his followers to drink poison the way Jim Jones did. He did not need to. The siege had already created the conditions for mass death. He had already convinced his followers that the government was an agent of Satan, that survival meant remaining loyal to him specifically, that leaving the compound meant surrendering to evil. When the fires started, whether Koresh ordered them or not, the decision to stay inside rather than evacuate was the same decision the People's Temple members made when they drank the poison. It was the decision that the prophet had prepared them for, the final test of faith, the moment when dying for the cause proved you were truly chosen. Koresh's prophecy was self-fulfilling. He predicted apocalyptic confrontation with corrupt authorities. He stockpiled weapons and taught his followers to expect warfare. He created conditions that made government intervention inevitable. When intervention came, he framed it as validation rather than consequence. And when the situation became unsustainable, when the compound burned, his followers died believing they had witnessed the end times exactly as Koresh had promised. The fact that the end times were manufactured by Koresh's own actions did not matter. The prophecy was fulfilled. The prophet was vindicated. The only cost was everyone's lives. Sullivan Knoth followed this pattern without studying David Koresh. He built his compound in isolation. He prophesied apocalypse. He armed his followers. He created an environment where external interference would be interpreted as the final battle. When Blake and Lynn arrived, when their presence contradicted Knoth's theology about preventing the Antichrist, The confrontation escalated exactly as Koresh's confrontation escalated. The difference is that Knoth did not face federal agents. He faced 2 journalists with a camera, but the pattern does not care about the scale of the threat. The pattern only requires that the threat validate the prophecy. Once that validation occurs, the ending is already written. But there is one more template, one more man who heard voices and convinced followers to die. This one does not involve isolation in the wilderness. This one does not involve government siege. This one involves a comet, a spaceship, and the belief that dying was the only way to leave Earth behind. Chapter 5: The Spacecraft That Never Came. Marshall Herff Applewhite was born May 17, 1931, the same year as Jim Jones, in Midlothian, Texas. He attended several universities and served in the United States Army. He pursued a career in education, becoming a music professor. By all external measures, he was succeeding. He was married, he had children, he held a respectable position at the University of St. Thomas in Houston. Then something fractured. In 1970, Applewhite resigned from his position, citing emotional turmoil. The details of what caused this breakdown are not fully documented, but the timing suggests psychological crisis. A year later, in 1971, his father died. Applewhite fell into severe depression. The structures that had defined his life, marriage, career, family, collapsed or became unbearable. He was hospitalized. During or shortly after this hospitalization, he met Bonnie Nettles, a nurse. Nettles was interested in mysticism, astrology, UFOs, and channeling. She told Applewhite that their meeting had been foretold to her by extraterrestrials during one of her mystical experiences. This explanation arrived at the exact moment Applewhite needed an explanation. His life had fallen apart. Traditional frameworks, religion, psychology, social expectation had failed to prevent or explain his breakdown. Nettles offered a different framework. She offered the idea that his suffering was not mental illness but spiritual preparation, that he was not broken but chosen, that extraterrestrials had orchestrated his crisis specifically to make him ready for his true mission. Applewhite accepted this framework completely. He and Nettles developed a close relationship. Platonic but intensely spiritual. They began calling themselves Bo and Peep, later Ti and Do, later the Two, referencing the 2 witnesses mentioned in the Book of Revelation. They believed they were extraterrestrials living in human form, that they had been sent to Earth to gather followers, that after their martyrdom and resurrection a UFO would appear and transport them and their followers to a higher level of existence. In 1972, they founded what would eventually be called Heaven's Gate. They traveled around the United States, holding meetings, attracting followers who felt equally displaced from mainstream society. The people who joined were not stupid. Many had college educations. Many worked in technical fields. Many had families and careers they abandoned to follow Applewhite and Nettles. What they had in common was the feeling that normal life was not enough, that there must be something more, that the mundane world was a prison they needed to escape. Heaven's Gate taught that human bodies were merely containers, temporary vehicles for souls that originated from a higher level of existence. The goal was to shed these containers and return to that higher level. Initially, Applewhite taught that this transformation would be physical, that a spacecraft would arrive and take them bodily to the next level where they would receive new, perfected bodies. The theology mixed Christian eschatology with New Age spirituality with science fiction, creating a narrative that sounded both ancient and futuristic, both religious and technological. The movement attracted hundreds of followers at its height in the 1970s. Members lived communally, pooling resources, following strict behavioral codes. They wore gender-neutral clothing and bowl-cut hairstyles to minimize individual identity. They were forbidden from sexual activity of any kind. Applewhite himself underwent voluntary castration and convinced several male followers to do the same, removing sexual desire entirely rather than attempting to suppress it. This is the same pattern of bodily control that appears in Jones's movement and Koresh's movement and Knoth's movement. The leader defines what the body is for. The leader determines which desires are permitted. The follower's body is not their own. In 1985, Bonnie Nettles died of liver cancer. This created an enormous theological problem. Nettles, T.I., was supposed to be an extraterrestrial in human form. She was supposed to ascend physically to the next level. Instead, her body died of a mundane disease and remained on Earth, unchanged, decomposing. The prophecy was falsified by observable reality. This is the crisis that destroys most movements. The leader's core claim is proven wrong by undeniable evidence. Followers defect. The movement collapses. But Applewhite did not allow this crisis to destroy Heaven's Gate. He adapted the theology. He explained that Nettles' spirit had traveled to a spaceship where it received a new body, that physical death was actually the mechanism of ascension, that what looked like failure was actually successful completion of her mission. The body left behind was just the container. The real T.I. was already at the next level. This reinterpretation is psychologically brilliant and theologically catastrophic. It solves the immediate problem of Nettles' death, but it creates a new doctrine that makes death the goal rather than the obstacle. If dying is how you ascend, if leaving your body behind is proof of successful transformation, then living becomes the problem. Physical survival becomes evidence you have not yet completed your mission. The movement's purpose shifts from waiting for a spacecraft to arrive to finding a way to die that counts as ascension rather than mere death. By the early 1990s, Heaven's Gate membership had declined significantly, from hundreds of members in the 70s to fewer than 50 by the mid-90s. The people who remained were the most committed, the ones who had invested decades into the movement, who had cut all ties with family, who had nowhere else to go even if they wanted to leave. Applewhite began posting teachings on the internet, attempting to recruit new members. He was stung by the criticism he received online, by mockery, by challenges to his cosmology from people who had never met him and felt no obligation to treat his claims respectfully. In 1995, Applewhite first spoke openly about the possibility of using death, what he termed exiting their vehicles, as a means of reaching the next level. He explained that everything human had to be forsaken, including the human body, before ascension could occur. This was not framed as giving up. This was framed as graduation. The rhetoric shifted from waiting for rescue to actively choosing to leave, from being taken to taking themselves. In July 1993, astronomers discovered the Hale-Bopp comet approaching the inner solar system. By May 1996, it became visible to the naked eye. The comet was extraordinary, one of the brightest comets of the 20th century, visible even in light-polluted cities. A photograph surfaced that appeared to show a trail of light following the comet. To most astronomers, this was an imaging artifact or background star. To Heaven's Gate members, this was proof of an extraterrestrial spacecraft hiding behind the comet, waiting to collect souls who were ready to graduate. Applewhite interpreted the comet as the sign they had been waiting for. The next level was sending a spacecraft. The window for graduation was opening, but the spacecraft could not land. The spacecraft could not collect them physically. They had to exit their vehicles first. They had to leave their bodies behind so their souls could board the craft and receive new bodies at the next level. In October 1996, Applewhite rented a mansion in Rancho Santa Fe, California. He told the owner his group consisted of Christian-based angels. The group isolated themselves. They recorded farewell videos, explaining their decision, describing their joy at finally reaching the moment they had prepared for. Many members praised Applewhite in their final messages, expressing gratitude for his guidance, certainty that they were making the right choice. In late March 1997, as the Hale-Bopp comet reached its closest approach to Earth, 39 members of Heaven's Gate ingested phenobarbital mixed with applesauce, masked the taste with vodka, and lay down in their beds. Some wore plastic bags over their heads to ensure death if the drugs somehow failed. They all wore identical black uniforms with patches that read Heaven's Gate Away Team. They wore Nike shoes. They died in shifts, some members helping others ingest the poison before taking their own doses, a coordinated sequence designed to ensure everyone completed the process. Marshall Applewhite died with them. Unlike Jim Jones, who may have been shot rather than poisoned, unlike David Koresh, who may have been killed by followers to spare him burning, Applewhite took the same poison he gave to everyone else. He died believing what he had told them to believe. He died waiting for a spacecraft that would never arrive. 3 men, 3 movements, 3 mass deaths. Jim Jones in Guyana, commanding followers to drink poison to avoid capture. David Koresh in Texas, burning with his followers in a compound surrounded by federal agents. Marshall Applewhite in California, ingesting barbiturates with his followers beneath a comet they believed hit a spacecraft. None of them knew Sullivan Knoth. Templegate existed in a video game released decades after their deaths, and yet Knoth followed their pattern exactly. He heard a voice. He gathered followers, he isolated them, he commanded their bodies, he prophesied apocalypse. He made death the only completion of the story he started. This is not coincidence. This is not 3 separate aberrations that happen to look similar. This is a specific pattern that emerges from specific conditions, a sequence that repeats because the underlying psychology remains constant. The pattern does not require the leaders to communicate. The pattern does not require conscious imitation. The pattern is what happens when certain personality types encounter certain circumstances and discover that religious authority is the most powerful tool ever invented for making people obey commands that should be unthinkable. But the pattern only works if people follow. The pattern only completes if ordinary individuals, people who are not prophets, people who are not delusional, decide that dying for the cause makes more sense than living without it. And that is the uncomfortable part. That is the part we need to examine closely. Because understanding why people like Sullivan Knoth give the orders is easier than understanding why people obey them. Understanding what makes a failed shoe salesman claim to speak for God is easier than understanding what makes mothers hand over their children to be killed. The answer is not stupidity. The answer is not weakness. The answer is something that exists in all of us. Something that makes us human. Something that cannot be removed without losing the capacity for meaning and connection and purpose. The answer is what we need to understand next. Chapter 6. Why we follow men like this. There is a question that haunts every analysis of apocalyptic cults. A question asked by people who cannot imagine obeying commands to die, who cannot fathom surrendering autonomy so completely that drinking poison feels like graduation rather than murder. The question is always phrased the same way. How could they be so stupid? The question is wrong. The question reveals more about the person asking than about the people who followed Jones, Koresh, Applewhite, or Knoth. Because the assumption embedded in that question is that cult followers are fundamentally different from the rest of us, that they possess some deficit or damage that makes them vulnerable to manipulation that would never work on normal, intelligent people. This assumption is comforting. This assumption is false. The people who joined the People's Temple were not stupid. Many were college educated. Many held professional jobs before joining. Many were politically aware, socially conscious individuals who correctly identified that American society was failing Black Americans, failing poor people, failing anyone who did not fit into narrow categories of acceptable citizenship. They joined because Jim Jones offered solutions that mainstream institutions refused to provide. He offered community that transcended racial barriers. He offered financial support through collective resources. He offered purpose through social justice work. These are not stupid reasons to join a community. These are rational responses to real problems. The people who joined the Branch Davidians were not stupid. Many came from religious backgrounds and were seeking deeper understanding of Scripture. Many were attracted to the group's emphasis on biblical prophecy and preparation for end times. Many found in David Koresh someone who seemed to genuinely understand the text at a level their previous churches did not. They joined because they wanted their faith to matter, to be more than Sunday morning performance, to actually prepare them for what they believed was coming. This is not stupidity. This is taking belief seriously. The people who joined Heaven's Gate were not stupid. Many worked in technical fields, in computers, in engineering. Many had advanced educations. Many were thoughtful people who felt alienated from a culture that valued materialism over meaning, consumption over transcendence. They joined because Marshall Applewhite offered an explanation for their alienation that made it purposeful rather than pathological. He told them they felt out of place because they did not belong here, that their discomfort was homesickness for a level of existence they had originated from. This is not stupidity. This is seeking coherence between internal experience and external explanation. And the people who followed Sullivan Knoth into the wilderness were not stupid. They were seeking spiritual community. They were seeking certainty in a world that offered nothing but ambiguity and disappointment. They were seeking a prophet who spoke with conviction rather than qualification, who claimed to know rather than suggesting possibilities. When Knoth climbed that mountain and returned with a ruined eye and absolute certainty about God's plan, the conviction was magnetic. The sacrifice proved he was serious. The blood proved he was willing to pay costs that ordinary preachers would never pay. This is not stupidity. This is recognizing commitment and mistaking it for truth. The sociological research on cult recruitment is extensive and consistently reaches the same conclusions. People do not join cults because they are broken. People join cults because they are seeking. They are seeking meaning in lives that feel meaningless. They are seeking community in societies that isolate individuals. They are seeking certainty in cultures that have abandoned shared truth. They are seeking belonging in systems that sort people into categories of worthy and disposable. These are not pathological needs. These are human needs. These are the same needs that drive people to join churches, political movements, social clubs, online communities. The need itself is universal. The tragedy is what happens when that need is weaponized. Cult leaders understand this. The successful ones, the ones who build movements that last long enough to kill hundreds, they understand exactly what they are offering and exactly what needs they are filling. Jim Jones did not promise vague spiritual fulfillment. He promised concrete solutions to housing discrimination, to poverty, to racial violence. He delivered on those promises, at least initially. The People's Temple ran actual programs that fed people, housed people, provided medical care. The fact that these programs were tools for building dependency does not change the fact that they met real needs that mainstream institutions ignored. David Koresh did not promise generic salvation. He promised deep understanding of biblical prophecy, the kind of verse-by-verse analysis that serious students of Scripture craved. He spent hours teaching, explicating, connecting passages across testaments. The fact that his interpretations positioned him as uniquely chosen does not change the fact that he provided intellectual engagement that many followers had never experienced in traditional churches. Marshall Applewhite did not promise easy transcendence. He promised a path that required discipline, sacrifice, complete transformation. He demanded that followers abandon sexuality, individuality, attachment to earthly pleasures. The fact that these demands created psychological dependency does not change the fact that many followers experienced genuine relief at having clear rules, at knowing exactly what was required, at replacing the confusion of secular life with structured purpose. Sullivan Knoth did not promise comfort. He promised hardship, sacrifice, trials that would test faith until only the truly chosen remained. He warned his followers that the road would be long and the horrors many. The fact that this warning was preparation for escalating abuse does not change the fact that many followers heard it as honesty, as a leader who respected them enough to tell the truth about what devotion would cost. This is the mechanism. The leader identifies a real need. The leader offers a real solution, at least initially. The leader delivers on promises in ways that build trust. Then, gradually, the leader introduces costs. Small costs at first. Attend more meetings. Donate more money. Distance yourself from family who do not understand. These costs feel reasonable because the benefits are tangible. The community supports you. The teaching challenges you. The purpose sustains you. Then the costs escalate. Surrender more autonomy. Accept more control. Obey commands that feel uncomfortable, but are justified as necessary for the mission. And by this point, you have already invested so much. You have already burned bridges with family and friends who questioned your involvement. You have already donated resources you cannot reclaim. You have already built your identity around being part of this community, around being chosen. Leaving means admitting you were wrong, means losing everything you have built, means returning to the emptiness you escaped from. Staying, even as the costs become unbearable, feels like the only option that preserves meaning. This is called the sunk cost fallacy. but that term makes it sound like a simple cognitive error. It is not simple. It is not merely cognitive. When the cost you have sunk is your identity, your relationships, your sense of purpose, walking away is not a rational calculation of future utility versus past investment. Walking away is psychological death. It is admitting that the years you spent, the people you abandoned, the parts of yourself you surrendered, were for nothing. The human mind will do almost anything to avoid that conclusion. It will rationalize abuse. It will reframe exploitation as testing. It will accept even death as proof of commitment, rather than face the possibility that the commitment was always a mistake. There is another mechanism at work, one that sociologists call bounded choice. The concept was developed by researcher Janya Lalich, who studied both Heaven's Gate and the People's Temple extensively. Bounded choice describes how cult environments create decision-making contexts where members genuinely feel they are choosing freely even though their choices are constrained by manipulated information, social pressure, and environmental control. Inside a cult, you are making choices constantly. You choose to attend the meeting, you choose to participate in the ritual, you choose to shun the defector, you choose to surrender your paycheck, you choose to drink the poison. These feel like choices because no one is physically forcing you. You are walking to the meeting on your own feet. You are opening your own wallet. You are lifting the cup to your own lips. The experience of choosing is real, but the context in which you are choosing has been carefully constructed to make certain choices appear rational and others unthinkable. The leader has isolated you from alternative information sources. The leader has surrounded you with people who validate the ideology and shun dissent. The leader has created an environment where questioning is evidence of spiritual weakness, where doubt is treated as demonic influence, where the only people you trust all agree that obedience is the path to salvation. Within this bounded context, drinking the poison genuinely feels like the right choice. It feels like courage rather than surrender. It feels like faith rather than manipulation. This is why arguing with cult members from the outside rarely works. You are offering them information that exists outside their decision-making context. You are saying the leader is lying, but they have experienced the leader's predictions coming true. You are saying the community is dangerous, but the community has provided them with support and purpose they found nowhere else. You are saying they are being manipulated, but they feel they are choosing freely. Your information cannot compete because it contradicts lived experience that feels more real than any argument you can make. The pattern works because it exploits needs that are genuine and offers solutions that initially function. By the time the solutions become mechanisms of control, by the time the costs become lethal, the member has already crossed thresholds that make retreat psychologically impossible. They have already obeyed commands they once would have refused. They have already accepted logic they once would have rejected. Each small step toward the final atrocity created precedent for the next step. Each previous obedience makes the next obedience feel consistent rather than escalatory. This is how mothers in Temple Gate allowed their children to be killed. Not because they did not love their children, not because they were monsters incapable of normal human attachment, because Sullivan Knoth had spent years teaching them that love meant protecting children from becoming the Antichrist, that mercy meant preventing suffering worse than death, that mothers who truly cared for their children would release them to God before corruption set in. The theology reframed infanticide as an act of love, and within the bounded context of Temple Gate, where no alternative voices were permitted, where every person they trusted agreed that Knoth spoke for God, where resistance meant being marked as heretic and hunted by Marta, the choice to surrender their children felt like the only choice a good mother could make. This is how ordinary people become participants in atrocity, not through sudden transformation into evil, through gradual normalization of the abnormal, through incremental acceptance of costs that would have been unthinkable at the beginning, through construction of decision-making contexts where horror becomes logic and death becomes salvation. The psychological research on this phenomenon extends beyond cults. The same mechanisms appear in genocides, in authoritarian regimes, in any system that requires ordinary people to participate in organized violence. The Milgram experiments demonstrated that average individuals will administer what they believe are lethal electric shocks to strangers when an authority figure instructs them to continue. The Stanford prison experiment showed how quickly people adopt abusive behaviors when placed in roles that authorize cruelty. The research on Nazi Germany revealed that most perpetrators were not sadists or ideological fanatics, but bureaucrats following orders within systems that normalized mass murder. The lesson is not that humans are fundamentally evil. The lesson is that humans are fundamentally social. We are wired to seek belonging, to trust authorities, to conform to group norms, to accept the reality that our community validates. These are adaptive traits. These are the mechanisms that allowed humans to build civilizations, to cooperate on scales impossible for other species, to create shared meaning and collective action. But these same mechanisms, when exploited by leaders who understand them, can transform communities into death cults. The question is not why cult members are different from us. The question is what circumstances would need to exist to make us vulnerable to the same manipulation. What would it take for you to surrender your autonomy to someone claiming divine authority? The answer is uncomfortable. It would take desperation. It would take a real need that mainstream institutions refuse to meet. It would take a charismatic figure who offered solutions that initially worked. It would take gradual escalation that made each new cost feel like logical extension of previous commitments. It would take isolation from alternative perspectives. It would take investment too profound to abandon without losing your sense of self. These circumstances are not rare. These circumstances exist right now for millions of people experiencing economic instability, social fragmentation, cultural displacement. The needs that drove people to Jones, Koresh, Applewhite, and Knoth have not disappeared. The mechanisms these leaders exploited have not changed. The pattern remains active, waiting for the next failed man to hear the next voice and decide he is chosen to gather followers for the next apocalypse. But there is one element in Sullivan Knoth's story that does not appear in the historical cases. There is one factor that amplifies the pattern beyond what natural psychology alone can produce. There is Murkoff. Chapter 7. The Voice That Was Never God. The Gospel of Knoth contains passages that describe the voice with unusual specificity. The voice comes through static. The voice emerges from interference on radio broadcasts. The voice tells Knoth things he wants to hear, things that validate his importance, things that reframe his failures as divine preparation. The voice is consistent enough to feel real. The voice is specific enough to feel personal. The voice commands him to do things that serve the voice's purposes while destroying Knoth's community. In Outlast 2, environmental clues and documents reveal the presence of radio towers around Temple Gate. These towers are not maintained by the Testament. These towers are Murkoff Corporation infrastructure, the same corporation that ran experiments at Mount Massive Asylum, the same corporation that built the Murkoff Psychiatric Institute for the Outlast trials, the same corporation that has spent decades researching how to manipulate human consciousness through technological means. The implication is direct. The voice Sullivan Knoth heard was not God. The voice was a Murkoff broadcast. The visions he experienced were not divine revelation. The visions were hallucinations induced by microwave signals targeting the brain's temporal lobe, the region responsible for religious experience, for the sensation of presence, for auditory hallucinations that feel externally sourced. The entire theology of Temple Gate, the entire sequence of escalating horror, was manufactured by a corporation testing whether they could use radio frequency technology to create and control a doomsday cult. This recontextualizes everything. Sullivan Knoth was not a prophet. He was a test subject. The followers of Temple Gate were not a religious community. They were unwitting participants in an experiment on mass psychosis. The children murdered to prevent the Antichrist died because Murkoff wanted data on how far they could push a community using broadcast psychological manipulation. The mass death at Temple Gate's ending was not spiritual transcendence. It was the conclusion of a corporate research project. But here is what makes this more disturbing rather than less. The manipulation does not absolve Knoth. The technology does not remove his agency. The broadcast could create conditions for delusion. The broadcast could not force specific choices. Knoth still decided to mutilate his eye. Knoth still decided to command child murder. Knoth still decided to build a theology around sexual control and apocalyptic violence. The voice suggested, Knoth enacted. This distinction is crucial because it reveals how institutional evil and individual evil interact. Murkoff created the conditions. Knoth filled those conditions with content drawn from his own psychology, his own needs, his own pathologies. Without the broadcast, Knoth might have remained a failed shoe salesman who heard occasional auditory hallucinations that he learned to ignore. Without Knoth's receptivity to the content, the broadcast might have produced nothing more than confusion and headaches in the population. The atrocity required both. The corporation needed the prophet. The prophet needed the voice that validated his transformation from failure to chosen. This is the same dynamic that exists in non-fiction cults, even without Murkoff-level technology. Jim Jones did not invent the idea of revolutionary action or collective death. He encountered those concepts in radical political movements of the 1960s and 70s. He adapted them to serve his needs. The culture provided the raw materials. Jones assembled them into his specific system of control. Neither the culture nor Jones alone could have created Jonestown. Both were necessary. David Koresh did not invent apocalyptic Christianity or armed resistance to government authority. Those ideas existed throughout American religious history. He encountered them in the branch Davidian tradition he inherited and in the broader culture of Texan gun ownership and anti-federal sentiment. He weaponized those existing ideas to build his compound and justify his arsenal. The culture provided the framework. Koresh filled it with content that served his messianic delusions. Marshall Applewhite did not invent UFO religion or the idea that humans are aliens in temporary bodies. Those concepts permeated New Age spirituality and science fiction throughout the 20th century. He encountered them through Bonnie Nettles and through the cultural moment he was living in, when space exploration had made other worlds feel proximate and achievable. He synthesized existing ideas into Heaven's Gate-specific cosmology. The culture provided the vocabulary. Applewhite arranged it into grammar that culminated in death. The broader point is that destructive movements emerge from interactions between vulnerable individuals, charismatic manipulators, cultural contexts that provide ideological materials, and often institutional forces that create or exploit the conditions for radicalization. Blaming any single element misunderstands the system. Saying Murkoff caused Templegate ignores Knoth's agency. Saying Knoth caused Templegate ignores the broadcast infrastructure that amplified his delusions. Saying the followers caused their own deaths by choosing to obey ignores the bounded choice context and the gradual manipulation that made obedience feel like devotion. The pattern operates at multiple scales simultaneously. At the individual scale, it exploits personal psychology and unmet needs. At the social scale, it exploits group dynamics and conformity pressure. At the cultural scale, it exploits available ideologies and acceptable narratives. At the institutional scale, it exploits or is exploited by organizations that benefit from control, whether those organizations are corporations conducting research, governments managing populations, or media systems that sensationalize cults without examining the conditions that produce them. Templegate is fiction, but Templegate is also accurate. It accurately represents how real cults operate, how real leaders manipulate, how real followers become trapped, how real institutions enable or create conditions for mass violence. The Murkoff element is speculative technology, but the underlying dynamic exists in reality. Governments have researched mind control. Corporations have studied manipulation. Intelligence agencies have run experiments on unwitting subjects. The revelation that an external force was amplifying Knoth's delusions is not science fiction. It is pattern recognition applied to documented history. MKUltra was real. The CIA program ran from 1953 to 1963, testing drugs, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and other methods on thousands of unwitting subjects to determine whether human consciousness could be controlled. Some subjects developed permanent psychological damage. Some took their own lives years after the experiments ended. The program was illegal. The program was secret. The program was eventually exposed through congressional investigation. The people who designed and authorized those experiments worked for the United States government. They were not comic book villains. They were bureaucrats who believed national security justified any method, any cost, any violation of human dignity. Murkoff is MK Ultra with better technology and corporate structure instead of government oversight. The horror is not that Murkoff is unrealistic. The horror is that Murkoff is extrapolation from documented reality. If MK Ultra happened, if institutions were willing to experiment on citizens without consent in service of control, then Murkoff-level experimentation is not aberration, it is continuation. It is what comes next when those programs move from government labs into private sector research, unbounded by even the minimal accountability that eventually exposed MK Ultra. So when Blake Langerman arrives at Temple Gate with his camera, when he documents the compound's atrocities, when he witnesses the theology that justifies child murder, he is not just recording a cult, he is recording the endpoint of a Murkoff experiment. The camera captures what the corporation wanted to test. Can broadcast technology create a self-sustaining death cult? Can a community be driven to mass infanticide through manipulated religious experience? Can the pattern that produced Jonestown be replicated and controlled through technological rather than purely psychological means? The answer, based on what Blake witnesses, is yes. The broadcast created the conditions. Knoth provided the content. The followers enacted the atrocity. The children died. The pattern completed. Murkoff collected data. And when the experiment concluded, when Temple Gate burned, the corporation moved on to the next project with zero accountability for the lives destroyed in pursuit of that data. This is institutional evil at scale. This is not a single corrupt individual, but an entire system oriented toward control without ethics, toward knowledge without limits, toward profit extracted from suffering. And the most disturbing element is that the people working for Murkoff, the researchers designing the broadcasts, the executives approving the experiments probably do not see themselves as monsters. They probably use the same justifications every institution uses when it violates human rights in pursuit of larger goals. National security, scientific progress, the greater good, the needs of the many, the unfortunate but necessary costs of advancement. The pattern works at every scale because the same rationalizations function at every scale. The cult leader tells himself that commanding death serves God. The follower tells herself that obeying commands proves faith. The corporation tells itself that experimenting on communities advances knowledge. The researcher tells himself that individual suffering is acceptable if it produces data that might prevent larger catastrophes. The executive tells herself that profit is neutral, that what clients do with Murkoff technology is not the corporation's responsibility, that they are merely providing tools and information. These rationalizations are not unique to Murkoff or to cults. These rationalizations appear everywhere humans organize into hierarchies that allow distance between decision and consequence. The executive who approves layoffs does not watch families lose homes. The politician who votes for war does not carry bodies from rubble. The cult leader who commands death often ensures he dies last or not at all. Distance creates permission. Abstraction enables atrocity. Sullivan Knoth stood in his chapel broadcasting final commands to his followers. His voice carried over speakers mounted throughout Temple Gate. He told them to poison themselves. He told them this was the gateway to paradise. He told them God commanded it. And they obeyed because the voice speaking through Knoth sounded like the same voice that had guided them for decades. The voice that had been right about persecution, right about trials, right about the world's corruption. They could not hear the Murkoff broadcast underneath. They could not separate the manipulation from the message. All they heard was their prophet telling them it was time to go home. Chapter 8. The Final Broadcast. Blake finds Lynn in the mines beneath Temple Gate. She is in labor. The pregnancy that Knoth has been hunting her for, the pregnancy he believes carries the Antichrist, is reaching its conclusion. Blake cannot protect her. Blake cannot stop what is happening. Blake can only witness, record, try to understand what is unfolding around them. The hallucinations Blake experiences throughout the game, the visions of his Catholic school, the memories of Jessica's death, the demon that pursues him through corridors that shift between Temple Gate and Saint-Hugh, Sybil. These are not random. These are Blake's own trauma being activated by the same Murkoff broadcasts, affecting the entire community. The radio towers do not discriminate. They amplify whatever psychological material already exists. For Knoth, they amplified messianic delusion. For the followers, they amplified religious fervor and obedience. For Blake, they amplify unresolved guilt about failing to protect Jessica, about being a child when a child could not have changed outcomes, about witnessing abuse he did not understand until it was too late. The broadcasts make everyone's nightmares real. They make internal horror external. They make metaphor literal. This is what happens when technology interfaces with consciousness without ethics. The machine does not care what it activates. The machine does not distinguish between religious ecstasy and psychotic break. The machine broadcasts, and the brain receives, and the result is collapse of the boundary between internal experience and external reality. Lynn gives birth. What exactly happens is deliberately ambiguous in the game's narrative. There is a baby. There might not be a baby. The baby might be real. The baby might be hallucination. Lynn dies. That part is unambiguous. She dies from complications of childbirth, from trauma, from the impossible stress of being hunted while pregnant, from being the focal point of Knoth's theology and Blake's desperate attempt to save her. And Sullivan Knoth, in his chapel, realizes that his theology has failed. Lynn's baby was born. He could not prevent it. The Antichrist, if that baby is the Antichrist, has entered the world despite every murder he commanded, despite every sacrifice his followers made. God has gone silent. The voice that guided him for decades has stopped speaking, or has started contradicting itself, or has revealed that it was never God at all. Knoth records a final message. His voice is hollow, defeated, recognizing failure without understanding what failed. He speaks about taking care of his children, about being powerless against Lynn's child, about God's silence since the storm and the birth. Then he takes his own life. The method is not shown directly in the game, but the implication is clear. The prophet who commanded so many deaths cannot face the collapse of his certainty. Death is preferable to admitting he was wrong. And throughout Temple Gate, his followers obey the final broadcast. They poison themselves. They die in their homes, in the chapel, in the fields they have tended for decades. They die believing they are entering paradise. They die believing Knoth's promise that this is the gateway. They die without knowing about Murkoff, without knowing about the broadcasts, without knowing that everything they believed was built on manipulated hallucination and a failed shoe salesman's desperate need to be chosen. Blake walks through the compound as bodies accumulate. The sun grows brighter, impossibly bright, painful to look at. He hallucinates being engulfed by light. He has a final vision of chasing Jessica through the school, finding her, hearing her promise she will never let him go. They pray together. The vision is comfort and torment simultaneously. Jessica promising to never let go is Blake's guilt promising to never release him, his trauma promising to define him forever, his failure to protect her becoming permanent identity. The game ends without resolution. Blake sits holding what might be Lynn's baby in the ruins of Temple Gate. The compound is destroyed. The followers are dead. Knoth is dead. Lynn is dead, and Blake is broken, his mind fragmented by trauma and Murkoff broadcast, and the witnessing of atrocity that no camera can adequately document. He survived physically. He did not survive psychologically. The investigation he came to conduct has consumed him entirely. This ending is not cathartic. This ending is not closure. This ending is what actually happens when communities follow the pattern to its conclusion. Everyone dies or is destroyed. The leader dies believing his own delusions, or dies knowing he was lying all along. The followers die believing they achieved transcendence, or die recognizing too late that they were betrayed. The survivors carry trauma that will never fully heal. The institutions responsible face no accountability. The pattern remains active, ready to repeat. You have seen the pattern now. You have seen how it starts with failure and desperation. You have seen how it transforms into divine mission through auditory hallucination, or calculated fraud, or technological manipulation. You have seen how it gathers followers by meeting real needs that mainstream institutions ignore. You have seen how it isolates communities and escalates demands and normalizes atrocity through gradual progression. You have seen how it ends in mass death, framed as transcendence. You have seen this pattern operate through Jim Jones in Guyana, through David Koresh in Texas, through Marshall Applewhite in San Diego, through Sullivan Knoth in a fictional Arizona compound that represents all of them. The details change, the structure remains identical. The pattern is replication, but there is one question left. The question that haunts anyone who studies these movements, who tries to understand how this keeps happening despite decades of documentation and analysis and warning signs that should be unmistakable to anyone paying attention. Why does the pattern still work? Why do people still join movements that follow this exact sequence? Why do communities still isolate themselves around charismatic leaders who claim divine authority? Why do followers still obey commands to die when every historical example demonstrates that the promised transcendence never comes, that the spacecraft never arrives, that paradise is always just bodies in rows and survivors carrying unbearable knowledge? The answer is not that people are stupid. The answer is not that education prevents vulnerability. The answer is not that you would see through the manipulation if you encountered it. The answer is uncomfortable. The answer is that the needs the pattern exploits are permanent features of human psychology, that the vulnerabilities it targets cannot be removed without removing our capacity for meaning, and that the specific conditions producing those vulnerabilities are not historical accidents, but ongoing features of how societies are structured. The answer is that the pattern works because we let it work, because we create economic systems that leave people desperate, because we build cultures that isolate individuals, because we abandon institutions that once provided community and purpose, because we mock people's search for meaning instead of offering better frameworks for finding it. The pattern works because the alternative we offer is alienation, meaninglessness, and individualism that promises freedom but delivers loneliness. Until that changes, until the conditions that make people vulnerable to profits change, the pattern will continue. Another failed man will hear another voice. Another community will gather around promises of salvation. Another compound will isolate itself. Another theology will justify atrocity. Another mass death will shock people who insist they could never be manipulated the same way. And the pattern will replicate again, identical in structure, different only in details, proving that we have learned nothing except how to be surprised each time it happens. Chapter 9. The Pattern You Cannot Unsee. There is a moment in every analysis of apocalyptic cults where the narrator is supposed to provide distance, to reassure the audience that this is historical curiosity, that these movements are aberrations, that the people who fall for charismatic prophets are fundamentally different from the rest of us. This is the moment where I am supposed to tell you that education prevents manipulation, that awareness creates immunity, that understanding the pattern means you would never fall for it yourself. I am not going to tell you that. I am not going to offer false comfort, because the research does not support it. Intelligence does not correlate with resistance to cultic manipulation. Education does not prevent vulnerability to charismatic authority. Understanding the pattern intellectually does not mean you would recognize it while experiencing it from inside. The people who joined Heaven's Gate included computer programmers, engineers, and individuals with advanced degrees. They understood technology, they understood science, they were capable of complex analytical thinking. None of that protected them from believing that a comet was hiding a spacecraft that would collect their souls if they ingested barbiturates in coordinated shifts. Intelligence is not armor. Education is not immunity. The vulnerabilities the pattern exploits exist in all of us because they are features of human psychology, not bugs that can be debugged through information. Consider what you would need to believe to join a movement like Temple Gate. You would need to believe that mainstream society is corrupt beyond redemption. Is that belief irrational? Look at income inequality. at environmental collapse, at political dysfunction, at institutions that serve the wealthy while abandoning everyone else. The belief that society is broken is not delusion. It is accurate observation of observable reality. You would need to believe that conventional religion has failed to provide genuine spiritual experience. Is that belief unreasonable? Look at megachurches that function like corporations, at clergy sex abuse scandals covered up by institutional hierarchies, at prosperity gospel that tells poor people their poverty is their fault. The belief that organized religion has become corrupted is not aberrant. It is shared by millions of people who have left churches that demanded money but offered no transcendence. You would need to believe that someone who speaks with absolute certainty and claims direct divine communication might actually possess truth that others lack. Is that belief unprecedented? Every major religion began with someone claiming to hear God speak, to receive revelation, to understand Scripture in ways previous generations missed. The belief that prophets exist is foundational to most spiritual traditions. The line between legitimate prophet and cult leader is clear only in retrospect, only after we know how the story ends. You would need to believe that sacrificing comfort and security for higher purpose is noble rather than foolish. Is that belief alien? Every hero narrative, every story about resistance movements and revolutionary action, every cultural message about standing up for what you believe, reinforces the idea that sacrifice proves commitment and comfort breeds complacency. The belief that meaningful lives require difficult choices is embedded in how we talk about courage and integrity. The difference between someone who joins a movement like Templegate and someone who does not is rarely about intelligence or awareness. The difference is usually about timing, about whether the person encounters the movement at a moment of particular vulnerability, about whether the specific promises the movement makes align with the specific needs the person is experiencing. Change the timing, change the circumstances, and the person who insists they would never fall for manipulation might be the person drinking poison in a compound. This is not theoretical. This is documented through decades of research on cult recruitment and retention. The average cult member is not less intelligent than the average person. The average cult member is not more damaged than the average person. The average cult member is someone who encountered a manipulative system at a moment when they were seeking something the system claimed to provide. That is the only consistent difference. Vulnerability plus opportunity plus a leader who knows how to exploit both. So when you look at Sullivan Knoth's followers, when you see mothers allowing their children to be killed, when you see men obeying commands to murder, when you see an entire community poisoning themselves on the orders of a self-blinded prophet, the question is not why they were stupid enough to fall for it. The question is what circumstances in your own life would need to change to make you vulnerable to the same pattern. What would it take for you to need belonging badly enough to surrender autonomy? What would it take for you to need certainty badly enough to accept someone else's absolute authority? What would it take for you to need meaning badly enough to believe a failed shoe salesman when he says God chose him to lead the elect to paradise? The answer is probably less than you want to admit. Financial collapse that destroys your stability, social isolation that makes you desperate for community, personal crisis that mainstream institutions fail to address, a charismatic figure who offers solutions that initially work, who meets needs you cannot meet alone, who gradually escalates demands in ways that feel like logical progression rather than manipulation. These circumstances are not rare. These circumstances are increasingly common in societies built on economic precarity, social fragmentation, and the collapse of institutions that once provided collective meaning. The pattern works now the same way it worked in 1978, in 1993, in 1997. The pattern will work tomorrow the same way it worked when Sullivan Knoth climbed his mountain and cut open his eye, because the pattern is not about specific beliefs or particular ideologies. The pattern is about the mechanics of control, the psychology of obedience, the transformation of human needs into weapons that can be turned against the people experiencing them. Understanding the pattern does not make you immune. Understanding the pattern makes you responsible. Once you see the structure, once you recognize the stages, you have an obligation to notice when the pattern is repeating. You have an obligation to speak when you see communities isolating around charismatic leaders. You have an obligation to resist when you see authority figures demanding escalating proof of loyalty. You have an obligation to question when you see movements claiming absolute certainty about apocalyptic futures. This obligation is uncomfortable because exercising it makes you the outsider, the skeptic, the person who questions when everyone else is experiencing certainty and community. Speaking up means risking rejection from groups you might want to belong to. Speaking up means appearing arrogant, claiming to see through manipulation that others cannot see. Speaking up means accepting that you might be wrong, that your concerns might be unfounded, that the movement might be legitimate, and your skepticism might cost you access to something genuine. But the alternative is silence while the pattern completes. The alternative is watching people you care about become increasingly isolated, increasingly controlled, increasingly willing to obey commands that should trigger alarm. The alternative is the moment after the mass death when everyone asks how this could have happened, when warning signs were obvious, when people tried to speak up but were dismissed as enemies of the faith. The people who survived Jonestown, the ones who escaped into the jungle, or were away from the compound when the poisoning occurred, many of them described the same regret. They saw warning signs. They noticed Jim Jones's behavior becoming more erratic, his demands becoming more extreme, his rhetoric becoming more apocalyptic, but they did not speak loudly enough. They did not resist forcefully enough. They told themselves Jones would never actually command death, that the White Night rehearsals were just theater, that when the real moment came, people would refuse. They underestimated how thoroughly the pattern had already trapped everyone inside the bounded choice context, where drinking poison felt like loyalty rather than murder. The people who left the Branch Davidians before the siege, the ones who defected and tried to warn authorities about weapons stockpiling and child abuse, many of them described the same frustration. They spoke up, they provided information, they begged law enforcement to intervene carefully rather than with armed assault, and they were ignored or dismissed as disgruntled former members with axes to grind, as people too weak to maintain faith, as enemies whose concerns could not be trusted. The siege happened anyway. The fire happened anyway. The children died anyway. The family members who tried to extract loved ones from Heaven's Gate, the ones who recognized Marshall Applewhite's teachings, were becoming increasingly focused on death. Many of them described the same helplessness. They attempted interventions. They sent letters. They showed up at the compound. And their loved ones, operating within the bounded choice context Applewhite had constructed, experienced these rescue attempts as attacks, as the corrupt world trying to prevent their graduation, as tests of loyalty that proved their commitment by refusing family ties. Recognition without intervention is not enough. Understanding the pattern without acting on that understanding does not prevent the pattern from completing, but intervention is complicated, dangerous, and often counterproductive. Attempting to extract someone from a high control group frequently drives them deeper into the group's embrace. The leader frames outside interference as persecution. The member experiences the intervention as proof that the leader was right about external enemies. The attempted rescue becomes evidence that requires increased commitment to the movement. This is the trap. Speaking up is necessary but often ineffective. Silence is complicity, but intervention can backfire. There is no clean solution. There is no method that reliably works. The best research suggests that maintaining contact without ultimatums, expressing concern without judgment, offering unconditional support if the person chooses to leave, these approaches sometimes create space for doubt to develop, but sometimes they do not. Sometimes the person cuts contact entirely. Sometimes the group forbids communication with family. Sometimes by the time you realize intervention is necessary, the person is already too committed to hear anything from outside the movement's framework. This is why prevention matters more than rescue. This is why understanding the conditions that create vulnerability is more important than trying to save individuals after they have already joined. If we want to prevent movements like Jonestown or the Branch Davidians, we need to address the desperation that makes people seek profits. We need to build societies that provide community, meaning, and support through institutions that do not exploit those needs for control. We need to create economic systems where failure does not equal catastrophe, where losing a job or a home does not trigger existential crisis that makes hearing voices feel like salvation. We need to rebuild institutions that once provided collective purpose without demanding absolute obedience. Labor unions that gave workers solidarity and political power. Civic organizations that created local community across class and race lines. Religious communities that offered spiritual experience without authoritarian control. These institutions have been systematically dismantled over decades, defunded, delegitimized, replaced with nothing except market relationships and individual consumption. The void those institutions left is the void that cults fill. Sullivan Knoth gathered followers in Arizona because they were lost in the world, and he offered guidance. They were not lost because they were weak. They were lost because the world is structured to produce lostness, to isolate individuals, to make collective action feel impossible, and individual salvation feel like the only option. Knoth offered collective salvation. He offered community built around shared purpose. The fact that the purpose was apocalyptic and the community was abusive does not change the fact that he was offering something real people needed and could not find elsewhere. Jim Jones built the People's Temple because it provided housing assistance, food programs, and racial integration in communities where government and churches offered none of those things. The fact that Jones was a manipulative sociopath does not change the fact that the programs he ran met real needs. If those needs had been met by non-abusive institutions, if poor and Black Americans in Indianapolis and San Francisco had access to support that did not require surrendering autonomy to a charismatic leader, the People's Temple would never have grown large enough to end in mass death. David Koresh gathered the Branch Davidians because they wanted their faith to be more than Sunday morning performance. They wanted deep engagement with Scripture, community that took belief seriously, preparation for the end times they genuinely expected. If mainstream Christianity had provided that intensity without demanding submission to messianic authority, if churches had offered genuine spiritual experience instead of corporate structures with religious branding, the Branch Davidians would not have needed a separate compound to practice their faith. Marshall Applewhite built Heaven's Gate because people felt alienated from a materialistic culture that offered consumption but no transcendence. They wanted to believe their lives meant something beyond work and shopping and entertainment. They wanted to belong to something larger than themselves. If secular society had provided frameworks for meaning that did not require believing in spacecraft hidden behind comets, if we had cultural narratives about purpose that were not tied to productivity or profit, Heaven's Gate would never have attracted the followers who eventually died believing they were graduating to a higher level. The pattern completes because we create the conditions that make it work. We build societies that isolate, economies that destabilize, cultures that mock the search for meaning while offering nothing meaningful in return. Then we act shocked when people seek profits, when they join movements promising certainty and community and purpose. Then we label them stupid, weak, damaged, other. Then we learn nothing, change nothing, and wait for the pattern to repeat. Templegate is fiction, but Templegate is warning. It shows the pattern in concentrated form, compressed into a game you can complete in hours rather than a movement that unfolds over decades. It shows you how it starts, how it escalates, how it ends. It shows you that the followers were not monsters. It shows you that the leader was not uniquely evil. It shows you that the pattern is replicable, predictable, preventable if we choose to prevent it, rather than simply observing with horrified fascination each time it completes. And it shows you one more thing, the thing that makes Outlast 2 more than just another horror game. It shows you that institutions like Murkoff exist, that corporations and governments do experiment on populations, that the technology for mass manipulation is real and advancing. MKUltra happened. Similar programs happened in other countries. The research did not stop when those programs were exposed. It went private, went corporate, went underground. The capability to broadcast signals that alter consciousness, that amplify delusions, that make hallucinations feel like revelation, that capability exists now. It is not science fiction, it is documented science. The question is not whether someone will use it. The question is whether anyone will stop them. The question is whether we will recognize manipulation while it is happening, or only after bodies are counted. The question is whether understanding the pattern is enough to disrupt it, or whether the pattern is too powerful, too well adapted to human psychology, too profitable for the institutions that deploy it. Sullivan Knoth is not the last prophet. Temple Gate is not the final compound. The voice that told him to sacrifice his eye, to murder children, to command mass death, that voice is still broadcasting. The frequency might be different. The technology might be more sophisticated. The corporation might have a different name, but the pattern remains active. You know the pattern now. You know how it starts with failure and desperation. You know how it progresses through isolation and control. You know how it ends with bodies and broken survivors. You know that intelligence does not prevent vulnerability. You know that the needs it exploits are permanent features of being human. You know that the conditions producing those needs are not accidents but features of how we have chosen to organize society. The question is what you do with that knowledge. The question is whether you watch for the pattern or ignore it until the next mass death makes headlines. The question is whether you speak up when you see communities isolating or stay silent to preserve your own comfort. The question is whether you work to change the conditions that make people vulnerable or accept those conditions as inevitable. The pattern is waiting for your answer. The pattern is always waiting. The pattern has infinite patience because the pattern knows that desperation is renewable, that failed men seeking validation are inexhaustible, that people needing meaning will always exist as long as meaning is treated as weakness rather than fundamental human necessity. Temple Gate burned, but the template survived. The blueprint is public. The next prophet is already listening to static, already hearing voices, already deciding that his failure is actually divine preparation. The next followers are already searching for community, already needing certainty, already vulnerable to anyone who claims to offer both. The pattern does not care that you understand it. The pattern is not afraid of your awareness. The pattern knows that understanding is not immunity, that recognition is not prevention, that watching the same tragedy repeat across decades has not stopped it from repeating again. The pattern knows something about us that we do not want to know about ourselves. It knows we will choose belonging over autonomy when isolation becomes unbearable. It knows we will choose certainty over doubt when ambiguity becomes intolerable. It knows we will choose meaning over survival when meaninglessness becomes worse than death. And the pattern is right, not because we are weak, not because we are stupid, because we are human, because we need connection and purpose and frameworks that make suffering feel like it serves something larger than random cruelty. These needs are not pathological. These needs are what make civilization possible, what allow cooperation and sacrifice and collective action toward shared goals. The tragedy is that the same needs that build communities also make us vulnerable to prophets who destroy them. The same capacity for devotion that creates families also creates cults. The same willingness to sacrifice for others that produces heroism also produces obedience to commands that should be refused. The vulnerability is inseparable from the capacity. You cannot remove one without removing the other. So we live with the pattern. We live knowing it will repeat. We live hoping we will recognize it before it completes. We live trying to build alternatives that meet the same needs without demanding the same costs. We live knowing we will mostly fail because the pattern is patient and we are not, because the pattern is simple and we are complicated, because the pattern knows exactly what it is doing and we are still figuring out what we need. Temple Gate is gone. Sullivan Knoth is dead. The testament of the new Ezekiel is destroyed. But the pattern that produced them remains active, embedded in human psychology, amplified by technology, enabled by institutions, waiting for the next failure to become the next prophet. You cannot unsee the pattern now. You cannot pretend you do not know how this works. You cannot claim ignorance when the next compound isolates, when the next leader commands death, when the next community believes poison is the gateway to paradise. The pattern has shown itself to you. The question is what you do when you see it happening again. The compound is quiet now. The bodies are still. The broadcasts have ended. And somewhere, in a different city, in a different country, a different man is failing at everything he has tried. He is hearing voices in the static. He is deciding those voices are God. He is gathering the first followers who will believe him when he says he is chosen. The pattern is already beginning again.